The screen is black. A low wind begins to howl, then blowing the crack of ice splitting like gunfire. Darkness fades into a night sky choked with snow. Searchlights sweep over a convoy trapped in frozen seas, black shapes of ships glazed white, their decks buried under ice a foot thick. The North Atlantic groans beneath them, the sound of a dying beast. Men move like ghosts across the steel decks, faces burned raw by cold, eyes hollow, beards stiff with frost. Every breath is a cloud of pain. In the distance, a flare arcs across the Arctic, dark green and terrible, revealing a frozen graveyard, masts jutting from the ice, oil burning blue on the water, lifeboats overturned and frozen in place. Somewhere a man's voice, hoarse Polish accent, shouts, "Torpedo port side!" But there is no room to run. The sea is a solid wall, the temperature 40 below, and every surface, rails, guns, ropes, welded together by nature's hand. A destroyer turns too slow, its hull shuddering and the sea itself explodes beneath it. The flash burns through the snow, then vanishes, leaving only the white silence. This is not the Arctic of explorers or dreamers. This is the Arctic of death, of Convoy PQ-99, where the 10th Escort Group fought the sea, the Luftwaffe, and the endless winter itself. And when dawn came, the commanders who survived would swear that they had seen men and ships frozen solid, still standing, still at their post, statues in ice, witnesses to madness. March 1942. North Cape, Norway, lay somewhere to the east, shrouded behind curtains of snow. To the west, nothing but water and darkness. The Arctic winter had not yet loosened its grip, and the men of the 10th Escort Group, veterans of 100 Atlantic crossings, knew that the sea north of Iceland was less an ocean and more a living machine that crushed the careless. The convoy, codenamed PQ-99, assembled in Scapa, that gray sanctuary of the Royal Navy under skies heavy with sleet. 35 merchantmen waited in line like exhausted cattle. Their hulls painted a dull frost white to blend with the ice floes. Their cargo was vital: tanks, trucks, ammunition, and food. The lifeline for the Soviet front promised by Churchill himself. Every man aboard knew the odds. The Germans had eyes in the sky. Focke-Wulf condors prowled the horizon, and under the black waves the Wolfpacks waited. Yet the worst enemy was not steel or fire. It was the cold commander Robert Sherbrooke, leading HMS Onslow, the flagship of the 10th Escort Group, wrote in his log, "There is no color here, only shades of white, gray, and fear. Even sound seems frozen." The ships left harbor under a sky like iron. Snow fell sideways, driven by winds that howled through the rigging like lost souls. Men lashed themselves to rails as they chipped ice from the guns. The spray froze the instant it touched metal. One by one, the destroyers took position around the convoy: Offa, Obdurate, Orwell, Oribe, and the smaller corvettes HMS Honeysuckle and Bluebell. Their wakes carved narrow scars through the black water before the ice sealed them again. To the east, invisible beyond the horizon, lay Murmansk, a name whispered like a prayer. If they reached it, the Soviets would have their supplies and Britain would have kept its promise. But between here and there lay 1,200 miles of death. The first days passed in silence. The sea hissed beneath sheets of snow, and the ships creaked as if protesting their own voyage. Crewmen wrapped scarves around their faces until they looked like mummies. Meals were eaten frozen. Coffee turned to slush before it reached the lips. At night, auroras danced above the horizon, shimmering curtains of green light, mocking the suffering below. "Heaven's fire," one sailor whispered, lighting the road to hell. By the fourth day, the temperature dropped to -45°C. The ice on the decks thickened until guns could no longer traverse. Entire lifeboats became frozen solid, ropes transformed into rods of glass. Sailors swung axes to free them, their hands bleeding through their mittens. At dawn on March 21st, the first warning came. A Condor aircraft appeared out of the clouds, its silhouette stark against the pale sky. It circled once, then vanished. Everyone knew what it meant. The Germans had found them. Sherbrooke ordered the convoy to tighten formation. The destroyers weaved in slow arcs, radar scanning the depths. Somewhere below, steel sharks were already moving into position. Hours later, a torpedo struck the Norwegian freighter Borghild. The explosion was muffled by snow, a dull thud that threw water and flame skyward. The ship broke in two, steam hissing as it hit the freezing sea. Men leapt into lifeboats and then froze where they landed. The spray turned instantly to ice, sealing them to their seats. The lifeboat drifted past Onslow like a sculpture, the faces white, eyes open, hands still gripping the oars. Jesus God, a gunner whispered. They froze solid. Sherbrooke didn't reply. He simply turned his eyes north toward the endless dark. That night the convoy sailed into a blizzard. Visibility vanished. The compass froze. The magnetic dials stopped. Ice formed so thick on the bridge windows that lookouts had to smash holes with hammers to see ahead. The world became a single sound. The roar of the wind, the crack of splitting ice, the endless moan of the sea beneath. At midnight, the destroyer Oribe lost contact. Her radio hissed with static, her lights gone. For 6 hours she was simply missing, swallowed whole by the storm. When dawn came, the snow thinned and Oribe reappeared, her decks unrecognizable, her guns and masts entombed in ice. Men climbed the rigging with picks and torches to free the antennas. One slip meant death. Fall overboard here and you froze before you could scream. In the wardrooms, the officers spoke quietly over maps. They were now halfway to the Barents Sea, and already 5 ships lagged behind, engines choking on frozen fuel lines. Sherbrooke faced a decision: turn back or press on. Orders from the Admiralty were clear: you press on. But the weather was not something the Admiralty had to endure. By the 10th day it was no longer a voyage but a siege. Ice weighed so heavily on the bows that the ships listed. Sailors took turns hacking at it, every stroke echoing through the hull. Sleep came in snatches, frost forming on eyelashes. A man's skin could freeze to a railing if he leaned too long. Then came the radio call that made even Sherbrooke's blood run cold. Enemy surface force. Sighted, course northwest. Estimated heavy cruisers. The Tirpitz, the giant of the north, had left its fjord. Panic rippled through the convoy. The memory of PQ-17, the convoy destroyed by fear of that same battleship, was still fresh. Sherbrooke knew that if the Tirpitz reached them, no escort could save the merchantmen. He gathered his officers. "We cannot run," he said quietly. "We will fight." The next hours were chaos, snow, static, confusion. Radar signals danced with ghosts. Every blip looked like death. But the Tirpitz never came. Whether the Germans lost them in the storm or hesitated at the edge of the pack ice, no one ever knew. By March 25th, the wind began to ease. A pale sun rose over a field of shattered white. The convoy limped forward, half its ships crippled, decks glittering like glass. The men looked more like statues than sailors, their movements slow, mechanical. When at last they sighted the dim coast of Russia through the haze, a cheer rose, not loud but raw and hoarse, the sound of men who had outlasted the impossible. Sherbrooke noted in his log that night, some claimed they saw men frozen at their posts on the Borghild. I do not doubt it. The sea here kills not with fury, but with silence. When the convoy reached Murmansk, only 23 ships remained. The rest had vanished, beneath the ice, into the depths, into memory. But the supplies arrived. The Soviets called it a miracle. The British Admiralty called it endurance. The men of PQ-99 called it survival and nothing more, nothing less. And for years afterward, when Arctic sailors spoke of that voyage, they said the same thing. The ocean itself had tried to kill them and nearly succeeded. The Barents Sea lay ahead, a vast breathing darkness where the horizon vanished into the blizzard and every gust of wind sounded like a scream from the deep. And the men of the 10th Escort Group, their faces blistered raw, their hands split open from salt and frost, pushed on through a world that no longer resembled Earth, but some frozen planet abandoned by God, the air filled with the taste of iron and oil, the decks groaning under the weight of ice that formed faster than men could break it, until even the guns seemed entombed in glass and the ships moved not through water, but through frozen dust, their hulls creaking like old bones. Still they advanced eastward, the compasses sluggish, the needles shivering like frightened animals. And Sherbrooke stood on the bridge of Onslow wrapped in his greatcoat stiff with frost, his breath curling like smoke, watching the convoy crawl across a sea that moved as if alive beneath its crust. Dark shapes of merchantmen swaying between ridges of floe ice that cracked and healed within the same heartbeat, a monstrous breathing, relentless and patient, as though the ocean itself had decided that no intruder would reach the Soviet shore. Above them faint lights appeared, the aurora smearing green fire across the clouds. Eerie, silent, mocking, and the sailors said the dead were walking there, souls of those frozen in earlier convoys, and some swore they heard knocking from beneath the ice, the ghosts of the Borghild or the Empire Penguin calling up through the frozen water. The temperature dropped further, -50 now, metal so brittle that a single hammer blow could shatter a railing, and when a deckhand slipped and struck his arm, the bone snapped cleanly like ice itself. Yet the men kept working because to stop was to die, and everywhere the same rhythm continued. Chip, hack, swing, breathe, curse, pray. As the sea grew meaner and the wind began to bring with it the low hum of distant engines. By dawn, a Heinkel He-115 appeared out of the snow, a gray specter skimming low, dropping flares that turned the storm yellow, and for a moment the convoy was illuminated in terrible beauty, frozen ships glowing like candles in a cathedral of death, tracers arced upward from honeysuckle and obdurate, red lines lost in the white, and then the bomber vanished, leaving silence except for the soft hiss of falling snow. The men waited for torpedoes that never came, waited until their nerves began to crack under the weight of the waiting itself, and in that paralysis the true enemy revealed itself. Not the Germans, not even the cold, but time, endless and grinding, where minutes stretched into eternities and every second was a negotiation with fear. One night the Orwell reported a sonar contact, the unmistakable pulse of a U-boat stalking from below, and depth charges thundered into the sea, their explosions muffled by the thick ice skin. Shockwaves racing through the convoy, geysers of black water freezing before they fell, coating everything in new layers of ice, so that when dawn returned the ships looked as though carved entirely from crystal, each mast and gun an icicle, each man a frozen statue that somehow still breathed. Engineers burned precious fuel to thaw the engines, fumes choking the lower decks, and Sherbrooke wrote that even the heat of the fires seemed powerless, swallowed whole by the cold before it reached their skin. And still the U-boats came unseen, firing blindly through the storm, one torpedo striking the HMS Harvester on her aft section, a bloom of orange in a universe of white, sending debris and men into a sea that would not forgive. They hauled survivors aboard, bodies stiff as planks, eyes wide, lashes crusted with ice, and as medics tried to revive them, some shattered into stillness the instant they touched the warm cabin air, as though life itself refused to return. When night fell again, no one spoke. The convoy reduced to whispers and the soft rasp of saws cutting away ice. On the fifth day the storm finally broke, revealing a sun pale as bone and a horizon littered with wreckage, pieces of hull, broken rafts, oil frozen into black mirrors, and beyond it, the open Barents. The ships moved forward like ghosts released from bondage, smoke trailing low, and for the first time in a week the men saw the color blue beneath the ice, that fragile shimmer of water that meant motion, survival. But the reprieve was cruelly brief, for the air patrols returned at dusk, silhouettes of Ju-88s against the weak sun, diving through clouds to drop bombs that exploded with dull thuds, their shockwaves throwing snow like shrapnel. The destroyers replied with everything they had, guns hammering, tracers carving paths through twilight, and amid the chaos a merchantman, SS Eldena, took a direct hit to her bow, flames turning instantly to steam as the cold devoured the fire. A hiss so loud it drowned even the guns, and in that moment men realized that even destruction was muted here, the Arctic swallowing sound as easily as life. By midnight the surviving ships had formed a ring around the crippled freighter, Onslow standing guard like a wolf in the storm, and when Sherbrooke finally ordered her scuttled, the crew watched silently as she sank beneath the ice. No wave, no ripple, just a slow, dignified disappearance into blackness. They buried the dead at sea, each body sliding beneath the surface and freezing into the water as it went, preserved perfectly, as though time itself refused to move forward. And so the convoy crawled eastward, haunted and half alive, until the northern lights returned once more, this time a great red veil rippling across the heavens, and the men looked up through frost-rimmed eyes and saw what seemed to be the reflection of their own blood in the sky. And in that terrible beauty they found the strength to endure another day, another mile, another heartbeat, the sea alive beneath them, unending, undefeated, whispering with every wave that it would outlast them all. The night fell without warning, as if the sun itself had been extinguished by the cold, and in that endless black the remnants of convoy PQ-99 crept forward through a sea that had turned to iron, the sky pressing down like a lid upon a coffin, the ships mere silhouettes of ice drifting in silence so complete that even the heartbeat of the engine seemed sacrilegious, and the men moved slower now, shadows within shadows, faces hollowed by frostbite and hunger, their movements automatic, their thoughts dulled by exhaustion until life itself felt like a distant memory. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, beyond the field of ice ridges and mist, came a sound that froze them where they stood. The long, low moan of a ship dying, a groan from metal twisted by pressure beneath the floes, and then, faintly, the crack of timbers as the Norwegian freighter Rimfrost vanished under a lid of ice without a single explosion or flash, swallowed whole in less than a minute, her lights flickering once beneath the surface like the eyes of a drowned god, and the men on Onslow watched in silence. No words left to describe what the Arctic could do, no prayers strong enough to command it to stop. Because here prayer froze on the lips before reaching heaven, and so they simply turned away and kept moving east, toward the black line of the horizon where Murmansk might still exist. But the dead did not stay gone on this sea. That was the curse of the Barents. Because at night, under the aurora's dim glow, bodies would rise from the deep, encased in ice, faces pale and perfect, eyes open and staring, drifting among the hulls like mourners in some frozen cathedral, bumping softly against steel plates with a sound like knuckles on a door, and sailors swore they saw them. Men from the Borghild, from the Eldana, from ships whose names had already been erased from the logs, moving slowly through the dark, their uniforms waving like banners beneath the ice, and one lookout on Oribi, barely 19, screamed when a frozen hand brushed against his line as he hauled it in, a hand still wearing a wedding ring that glinted in the lantern light before breaking away and vanishing beneath the floe. By dawn, madness had begun to creep in, subtle as frost, and Sherbrooke himself wrote later that he feared the men were losing their reason, for they began to speak to the sea as if it could answer, to salute the corpses that drifted past, to whisper to the ice calling it by name, and still they worked, chipping, steering, keeping watch, because duty was the only thing left between them and despair. When the storm broke again on the 7th day, the cold became a living force, a weight that crushed lungs, and the wind brought with it the stench of oil and something else, the smell of the dead thawing for a moment before freezing again, and the snow fell not in flakes but in tiny blades that cut the skin, and through it came the low drone of engines once more, not German this time but something more terrifying, the groan of the ice field itself beginning to move, shifting under the weight of the ships, squeezing them together with slow inevitability, hulls grinding like the teeth of giants, and for hours they could do nothing but wait, listening as the sea rearranged itself around them, metal bending, rivets popping, the decks trembling underfoot. One sailor later said he felt the heartbeat of the ocean through the soles of his boots, steady and monstrous, as if the world itself were alive and aware of their trespass. When the movement finally stopped, 3 merchantmen were gone, crushed beneath the ice as neatly as insects beneath glass, and the others trapped fast until the next thaw. That night, as if to mark the Arctic's victory, the aurora turned red again, blood red this time, spreading across the heavens in wide, fluttering sheets that painted the ice in a glow like firelight. And in that unearthly illumination the convoy appeared not as ships but as tombs drifting through hell, and men began to sing softly to keep the darkness away, hymns and folk songs from villages far away, from Poland, from Yorkshire, from Bergen, voices thin and cracked, rising into the cold air where they froze and fell like snow. Somewhere in the midst of that strange choir, a signal came through the wireless, faint, distorted, almost a whisper, a Soviet escort approaching from the east. A single word repeating through the static, Murmansk, Murmansk, and it was as though the sea itself laughed. For the moment the message reached them, a new storm rose out of nowhere. A wall of white swallowing everything, the wind roaring high enough to tear flags from masts, visibility reduced to nothing, and for 36 hours the convoy vanished into that blizzard. No bearings, no sound but the screaming wind and the pounding of hearts. Men lashed themselves to guns to keep from being blown overboard. Others froze standing up, their hands welded to the rails, and when at last the storm passed, the survivors found them still there. Lookouts stiff as statues, ice sheathing their faces, eyes open toward the dawn that would never come, and they left them that way, unable to pry them loose, the dead still guarding the living, and Sherbrooke wrote in his journal one final line for that night. The sea does not forgive. It remembers. Morning came like a wound tearing open in the clouds, a faint bruise of light spreading across the frozen horizon as convoy PQ-99 entered the killing ground north of the Kola Inlet, the air brittle enough to shatter, the sea a sheet of glass flecked with drifting ice that clicked softly against the hulls like the ticking of a vast clock, counting down to death. And the men of the 10th Escort Group knew the storm's silence was not mercy but prelude. because the sky itself felt heavy, expectant, and even before the first shadow appeared, they could sense the eyes watching them from above, the Luftwaffe coming back to finish what the sea had begun. At 1100 hours, a scout cried out and every head turned upward. Black dots against the sun, growing fast, engines howling through thin air, and then the sky erupted in movement. Ju-88s diving from the clouds like hawks, the sunlight flashing on their wings, bombs falling in slow arcs that seemed almost graceful before they struck. And suddenly the Arctic was fire and thunder again. Snow vaporized into steam, ice exploding outward like glass shrapnel. Men flung across decks that instantly froze beneath them. And amid it all, Sherbrooke's voice rose clear through the din, steady and impossibly calm. "Return fire, steady, steady." And the guns answered, black mouths vomiting flame into the white world, tracers climbing toward the heavens, the recoil shaking the ice loose from the rails, and for minutes that stretched like hours, the convoy and the sky devoured each other, ships wrapped in smoke that drifted sideways on the wind until friend and enemy were only silhouettes, shadows within shadows. One bomb hit a ribby dead amidships, tearing her open, sending a column of black water skyward, and through that curtain of spray the survivors clung to cables slick with blood and oil, some slipping away soundlessly, vanishing before they struck the surface because the spray froze around them mid-fall, capturing their shapes like statues carved in motion. And when the smoke cleared, there was no Oribe anymore, only an oily scar across the ice and a few cries that died within seconds. But still the Germans came wave after wave, the iron sky unending. And the men fought until their guns turned red, until the barrels warped from heat that the cold could not kill fast enough. And even when ammunition ran low, they fed the belts by hand, refusing to stop, refusing to look away from the horror overhead. Somewhere astern, the SS Empire Flame burned like a beacon, its cargo of fuel and trucks exploding in pulses that lit the convoy like lightning, each flash revealing new wreckage and a mast sheared clean, a body spinning weightless through the air, a lifeboat aflame. The gunners on Honeysuckle kept firing until one by one they collapsed from exhaustion, faces white beneath soot, eyes rimmed with ice, and yet each time the sky seemed empty, another shadow appeared, another scream of engines, another descent. Finally, as if even the enemy had grown weary of slaughter, the bombers banked away toward the west, leaving behind a silence that felt obscene, broken only by the crackle of fires and the slow groan of ships settling deeper into the ice. Sherbrooke lowered his binoculars, his breath fogging the glass, and whispered to no one, "So this is how God tests steel." Through that afternoon they buried the dead, sliding bodies into the water because there was no room left on deck, and the sea took them greedily, freezing their shrouds the instant they touched the surface, white forms drifting beneath the ice like angels lost between heaven and hell. Engineers worked through the night patching holes, their hammers dull in the wind, sparks from torches freezing before they hit the ground. Inside the mess, the survivors drank coffee black as oil, hands trembling too much to lift the cups, staring at the walls where frost bloomed like fungus. No one spoke of fear. It was useless, as common as the air they breathed. Instead, they talked of home, of spring, of green things that seemed impossible now. One man from Glasgow said he would never complain of rain again. Another laughed until he coughed blood. At dawn, the weather cleared, and for the first time in weeks, the sun broke through clean and sharp, turning every surface to mirror, blinding the men until tears ran down their faces and froze there. In that light, the wreckage looked almost beautiful. Twisted masts glittering, oil shimmering rainbow beneath the ice, seagulls wheeling above the dead, and for a fleeting instant they could almost believe they had survived. Then came the message from the Admiralty, crackling over the radio like a ghost. "Proceed to Kola, maintain schedule. Reinforcements en route." It was absurd, almost cruel, but orders were orders, and Sherbrooke gave the command without hesitation. Engines coughed, propellers groaned. The convoy moved again. By evening, they reached open leads of water where the ice thinned and the waves returned, sluggish and heavy as molten metal, and the men leaned on the rails to watch them, hypnotized by motion, until the cry went up from the Bluebell's lookout, "Submarine wake, port bow!" And once more the sea became chaos, depth charges roaring, geysers rising, the ships swaying in the aftermath. They never found the U-boat, though oil slicks and fragments of timber bubbled to the surface, and Sherbrooke recorded it as possible kill, though he knew better. Nothing truly died in this sea. It only slept. When night came again, clear and cruel, the aurora spread wide above them, green and violet curtains waving across the stars, and the sailors stood in silence, mouths open, because after all they had endured it looked like salvation. A light that seemed to promise warmth even as it froze their skin. Some said they saw faces in it, the visages of the lost. Others claimed it was the reflection of burning ships below the horizon. But none spoke for long. The Arctic demanded reverence, and when the lights faded and darkness returned, the sea was as calm as a grave. Sherbrooke wrote his final entry for that day. "We are close to Russia now. The men can smell land, but I wonder if any of us will touch it. The sky feels heavy again." The wind was behind them now, a low, mournful push that seemed almost merciful after weeks of defiance, and the remnants of Convoy PQ-99 slid eastward, toward the gray outline of the Kola Inlet, as though the sea itself, exhausted by the slaughter, had finally decided to let them go. Yet every mile carried ghosts with it. Every wake a funeral procession stretching into the horizon where the sun lingered just above the ice like a dull coin refusing to set. And the men aboard the surviving ships, Onslow, Orwell, Honeysuckle, and a handful of shattered merchantmen, moved like phantoms through routines too old to abandon, chipping at ice that no longer formed, checking bearings they no longer trusted, their minds hollowed by the endless white until memory itself felt frozen, preserved somewhere behind the eyes but unreachable. They had forgotten what warmth was, forgotten color, forgotten even the sound of their own voices, for conversation had dwindled to grunts and nods, language reduced to survival. And still the Arctic refused to release them fully, for even in its calm, the cold bit like a blade drawn slow across the skin, and beneath the thin crust of the thawed sea shapes drifted, wreckage, corpses, splinters of entire ships, moving in lazy circles as if unwilling to sink, unwilling to rise, a graveyard without bottom. On the bridge, Commander Sherbrooke stood wrapped in layers of salt-stiff cloth, his binoculars pressed to eyes that no longer blinked from habit but from pain, watching the horizon where, through a slit in the clouds, he thought he saw smoke, Russian destroyers coming to meet them. And for a moment he allowed himself the smallest thought of deliverance, though he did not say it aloud, for hope was something men no longer trusted out here, a word too fragile for the weight of the ice. Behind him, the crew of Onslow gathered quietly, each man aware that they were about to leave behind the place that had swallowed half their friends. And as the coast of Russia grew clearer, low hills crusted with frost, signal flares arcing from the escorting ships like fireflies, they felt not triumph but weariness so deep it seemed to reach the marrow, and yet within that exhaustion was something like pride. A grim, cold pride born not of victory but of endurance, the knowledge that they had outlived the sea's hunger for one more night. When they entered the inlet, Soviet trawlers lined the banks, their decks crowded with sailors waving, shouting words that the British could not understand but felt all the same, and the air filled with sirens, horns, cheers, the sound of life returning, though the men of PQ-99 stood motionless, faces unreadable, eyes fixed on the mountains beyond, too tired to celebrate. The harbor stank of coal and fish and smoke, warm scents that made them dizzy, and when their boots touched solid ground many wept without sound, tears freezing before they fell. Sherbrooke disembarked last, saluting the Russian commander who met him with vodka and embraces, and as they toasted the fallen, he raised his glass to the north where the storm still lingered like a bruise and said softly, "For those still watching," then drank, the alcohol burning through his throat like sunlight. In the days that followed, the survivors were tended, their frostbite dressed, their stories taken down by officers who could not believe half of what they heard. Men frozen standing, torpedoes trapped in ice, fires that burned cold. But those who had been there spoke little, for they knew the truth could never be written, only felt in the marrow when the wind blew from the north. When spring finally came and the convoy's remnants prepared to return west, they watched from the deck as the ice broke apart behind them, the frozen road home splitting into fragments that drifted away like ghosts, each floe carrying the memory of a ship, a face, a name lost to the cold, and the men turned their backs to it without farewell, for the Arctic kept its dead. Weeks later, in Scapa Flow, the battered hulls limped into harbor, paint stripped to bare metal, flags hanging in tatters, and the Admiralty sent telegrams of congratulations, calling PQ-99 a success, a testament to Allied courage. But among the sailors the word meant nothing. Success was survival, and survival had no glory. They buried what bodies could be recovered in the wind-swept cemetery above the cliffs. No band, no speeches, only the hiss of rain and the cry of gulls. And when the chaplain read the final verse, the clouds parted for a heartbeat and a beam of sunlight touched the graves, faint and colorless but enough to make the steel of the crosses gleam like ice. And every man present knew that light had followed them from the Arctic itself, a last gesture of respect from the sea that had tried to kill them. Years later, when the war was over and the North Atlantic returned to its cold silence, Sherbrooke visited those graves alone, older, his face drawn with the weight of too many memories, and he stood before the simple stone that bore the names of his men and whispered, "They say the sea forgets, but I do not," then turned toward the horizon where the wind smelled faintly of salt and snow, and for an instant he thought he heard again the slow grinding of ice, the faint clang of chains, the murmured voices of the lost calling through the fog, and he smiled, not in sorrow but in recognition, because he knew the Arctic never truly let go, it only waited, eternal and indifferent, holding its secrets beneath the frozen waves. And as he walked away, the sky darkened with the approach of winter, and the first flakes began to fall, each one a perfect echo of that journey long ago, each one a memory descending from the iron sky. And in that quiet snow the story of PQ-99 settled at last, not as legend, but as truth carved in frost and steel, the tale of men who sailed to the end of the world, froze, bled, and still moved forward, leaving behind on that white horizon a line no storm could erase, the frozen road home.